When you begin to truly understand the impact of caring too much about what other people think, you start to see how deeply it has influenced almost every area of your life without you even realizing it. From the decisions you make in your career, to the way you express yourself in relationships, and even the goals you choose to pursue, much of it has likely been shaped by an invisible pressure to be accepted, approved of, or validated by others around you. This constant need for external approval slowly builds an inner limitation that keeps you from stepping fully into your potential. Because instead of acting from confidence, you start acting from fear of criticism. Over time, this creates a mental pattern where your own voice becomes quieter than the opinions of others, and your personal desires are often delayed or completely abandoned just to avoid judgment. The truth is that this habit is one of the biggest reasons people feel stuck, unfulfilled, or disconnected from their real identity. When you study the teachings inspired by Dr. Joseph Murphy, you begin to understand that the subconscious mind is incredibly powerful, and it absorbs the beliefs you repeatedly accept as true. If you constantly believe that others are judging you, or that your worth depends on their approval, then your subconscious mind begins to shape your behavior accordingly, reinforcing hesitation, self-doubt, and insecurity. But when you consciously decide to break free from this cycle, something remarkable happens internally. You begin to reclaim control over your thoughts, emotions, and actions. You start to realize that most people are actually too focused on their own lives, struggles, and insecurities to constantly judge yours the way you imagine they do. This awareness alone can be incredibly liberating because it removes the exaggerated importance of external opinions. As you grow into this mindset, you begin to act with more authenticity, speaking your truth more freely, and making choices based on what genuinely aligns with your values instead of what might be socially approved or criticized. Slowly, your confidence becomes internal rather than dependent on outside feedback. And this internal confidence is what creates lasting peace and personal strength. You stop overthinking every move, stop replaying conversations in your head, and stop shrinking yourself just to make others comfortable. Instead, you start expanding into the person you were always capable of becoming. Not because the world suddenly changed, but because your perception of it did. This shift is not instant, but it is powerful. Because every time you choose self-trust over approval-seeking, you reprogram your mind toward freedom, clarity, and emotional independence. As you continue to release the habit of caring excessively about what others think, you start to notice a deeper transformation taking place within your emotional world and decision-making process. Situations that once triggered anxiety, hesitation, or overthinking begin to lose their control over you, because your focus gradually shifts from external validation to internal stability. Instead of asking, "What will people say?" you begin to ask, "Is this right for me?" This subtle but powerful shift changes everything about how you move through life. You no longer feel the need to explain or justify every choice you make, and you stop allowing imaginary criticism to dictate your actions. In fact, much of the fear that once felt so real begins to dissolve when you realize that most of it was never based on actual events, but rather on assumptions created by your own mind. From a perspective inspired by the teachings associated with Dr. Joseph Murphy, the subconscious mind responds not only to external experiences, but also to the repeated thoughts and emotions you feed it daily. When you repeatedly imagine rejection or judgment, you condition yourself to feel restricted and defensive in situations where freedom should exist. However, when you consciously replace those thoughts with self-acceptance and inner confidence, your subconscious begins to reorganize your emotional responses in a more empowering direction. Over time, this leads to a noticeable change in how you carry yourself, how you communicate, and how you respond to challenges. You become more grounded, less reactive, and more intentional in your behavior. Even when others express opinions or criticisms, you begin to observe them without internalizing them as truth. This creates emotional distance between your identity and external judgment, allowing you to remain centered regardless of outside noise. As this mindset strengthens, You also begin to attract different experiences because your energy shifts from seeking approval to expressing authenticity. People respond differently to you because you are no longer operating from insecurity, but from self-assurance. This does not mean that you stop caring about people altogether. Rather, you stop allowing their perceptions to define your worth or direction. You begin to understand that approval is temporary, but self-respect is permanent. The more you practice this awareness, the more natural it becomes to trust your own judgment, even when it differs from the crowd. Eventually, you reach a point where the fear of being misunderstood no longer holds power over you, and you become comfortable with the idea that not everyone will agree with you, support you, or understand your path. Yet instead of feeling discouraged by this, you feel free because your sense of identity is no longer dependent on external agreement. As this inner transformation deepens, you begin to experience life in a completely different way, where your emotional reactions are no longer controlled by the approval or disapproval of others. You start to notice that situations which once felt overwhelming or intimidating now feel much lighter, because your mind is no longer constantly projecting fear of judgment onto every experience. Instead, you begin to operate from a place of calm awareness, where your choices are guided by clarity rather than anxiety. This shift allows you to move through challenges with greater resilience, because your energy is no longer wasted on trying to manage how everyone perceives you. You realize that trying to control public opinion is not only exhausting, but also impossible. And this realization frees up mental space that was once filled with unnecessary worry. In that space, creativity, confidence, and self-expression begin to grow naturally. You also begin to notice that your relationships change as your mindset evolves. Some people may adjust to the new version of you easily, while others may resist it because they were accustomed to a version of you that sought approval or avoided confrontation. However, instead of fearing these changes, you begin to accept them as a natural part of growth. You understand that authenticity will sometimes challenge existing dynamics, but it will also attract more genuine and respectful connections into your life. From the perspective inspired by Dr. Joseph Murphy's teachings on the subconscious mind, this transformation is not accidental, but deeply rooted in the way your inner beliefs shape your outer reality. When your subconscious is no longer dominated by fear of judgment, it begins to support a more confident and self-directed version of you. Your thoughts become more aligned with self-trust, and your emotional responses begin to reflect inner stability rather than external pressure. As this alignment strengthens, you may even find that opportunities begin to appear differently, not necessarily because the world has changed, but because your perception of it has changed. You start to take more initiative, speak with more certainty, and act with less hesitation. This does not mean you become careless about feedback or completely indifferent to others, but rather that you learn to filter input through your own sense of truth instead of accepting it blindly. Over time, this creates a strong foundation of inner independence, where your self-worth is no longer fluctuating based on praise or criticism. Instead, it remains steady, grounded in your own understanding of who you are and what you stand for. This is where true confidence begins to emerge, not for being liked by everyone, but from no longer needing to be.